Hello and welcome to Why It Matters, Integration Unraveled, a Blueprint 1543 podcast. I'm Rebecca Dorsey, co-founder and vice president of Blueprint 1543. At Blueprint, our mission is to support the development of integrated people, integrated churches, and integrated inquiry to help people ask and answer some of life's biggest questions using the tools of the sciences and the Christian faith. The goal of this podcast is to ask, why does integration matter in each of these areas? In everyday sciencey people's lives, in churches, and in scholarly inquiry. Today, we're going to go behind the scenes and approach real people doing real work and see if the integrated approach is there. Welcome to the podcast, Bonnie Zahl. Bonnie, it's so fun to have you here. I want to just start by letting you introduce yourself through some of the titles that you identify with in life right now.
I am currently a principal advisor for Templeton World Charity Foundation, where I support and advise the foundation on its grant making. I am also an advisor for Templeton Religion Trust, doing similar work. I am also a mom and a spouse, and I am an expat. I live in England. I'm from Hong Kong originally. So I guess those are some of the titles I hold.
Sweet. And as I understand it, you are a developmental psychologist and researcher and all-around grant development guru. How did you end up in developmental psychology?
First correction, I'm actually not a developmental psychologist. I'm a social technology. But how did I get there? It's a really long story. When you sent me that prompt, I was like, oh, how far back do you want to go? I don't think I really started intentionally becoming a professional psychologist, if I could even call myself that. I really stumbled into psychology, and I'm not really sure I ever really knew what I wanted to be or do when I was growing up. So when I was growing up as a teenager in Hong Kong, my mother bought me this really funny fridge magnet, which says, I do many things well, none of which generate income. Well, which is not entirely accurate now because I do generate an income with the work that I do. But when she gave me that magnet, I was in that phase of like being a teenager where you're just exploring a lot of things. And I was spending a lot of time doing music and musical theater. And she was just looking at that trajectory and thinking, you're pretty good at that, but that's not really going to generate a whole lot of income. And at that point in my life, I was spending a lot of time in Hong Kong and abroad doing music. And then, of course, a few years later, when my faith became much more of a real thing to me, which we can come back to in a little bit, I spent a lot of time on mission trips, and I spent a year working with a missions organization. And there was a brief window when I thought that was what I was going to be doing. So that still falls into the doing many things, none of which generate income category. But when I was in missions, I just thought I wanted to devote my entire life to telling people about how deep and how high and how long and wide was God's love for them through Jesus Christ. Because learning about that, I don't know, somehow when that knowledge became real to me, it was the most transformative and extraordinary thing that I felt had happened to me. And so at age 19, I had deferred entry to college, and I was working for this missions organization, and I thought I was just going to not go to university. But to cut a long story short, and that's another story for another day, I did go to university, where I did eventually major in psychology after, I think, cycling through maybe 4 major declarations.
That's a lot of paperwork.
Yeah, it was a lot of paperwork. And the reason I came to that was I realized every time I was doing the readings for whatever's history or folklore or mythology or whatever it was, like the only thing that was really most interesting to me was what people thought and felt. Like I was most interested in the stories or the narratives about people's interior lives. And I think it was like only when I was like doing history and I was like failing my history classes because I wasn't remembering the right dates, that I was super interested in human motivations for choices and actions that led to historical events. I was like, oh, maybe I should major in psychology. So I switched into psychology. And then, so that's how I began being interested in psychology. And the area of psychology I became most interested in and what I did my PhD in was psychology of religion. And how I came into that was we were in a social psych class learning about a concept in social psychology called locus of control, which many people may have heard of. It's where people often have either an internal locus of control where they feel in control of their own actions and their trajectories of their lives versus external locus of control where they felt like the things that happened to them were due to external circumstances that they had little control over. And the latter form of locus of control is often associated with depression and other sort of psychological issues. And I raised my hand and in that lecture and I said, what about people who believe in God? Because God is not inside, but God is not outside in the same way that you're describing external locus of control. And my professor, Brian Little, who I'm very fond of, he's like, that's a great question. Go and write a paper. And that was how I started getting interested in psychology of religion. And it made me, at that point, I was like, there's so much about human experience of the religious that we don't really know how to describe yet. And psychologists clearly had not really thought about. And that's what made me interested in pursuing psychology of religion eventually.
Now, let's go back to that fridge magnet moment. I just learned so many things about you that I didn't know, which is really fun. First question, what kind of music or musical theater were you doing?
When I was like 14, I think I was in the production of The Music Man. That was done at American Community Theater in Hong Kong. And I don't even remember how I got involved. I think maybe it was through like the Youth Arts Festival or something. So I was doing like musical theater there. But the thing that brought me abroad was I was part of this music group that performed American shape note folk music, but also world folk music. And so my parents, bless them, this is pre-cell phones, pre-email. Like I was like, I want to go to this camp in America. It's in like Vermont, which I've never been to, but they sing this great harmony singing. Mm-hmm. I really want to try that. And they're like, okay. And they just put me on a plane and I signed up. They put me on a plane and they just trusted that like I would get picked up at the airport and someone would take care of me and then I would go back home. Which now I have teenage children and they're checking in on you as much as you're checking in on them. Sometimes they're checking in on me more than I'm checking in on them. And that was I spent 3 summers doing that, just touring all around the northeastern part of America, different countries in Europe, learning sacred music, secular music, all kind of close harmony singing.
How old were you when you first loaded to a plane and headed for this unknown camp?
I think I was 14 or 15.
Okay. My only sort of equivalent crazy story when I was in 6th grade or maybe the summer after 6th grade, I saw an ad for U.S. space camp and I was very interested in being an astronaut at that point in my life. I wrote down the phone number really quick from the TV ad and told my parents, I want to go to space camp. And somehow I was put on a plane that summer by myself to fly across. I lived in Oregon at the time, so had to get to Florida. And is she going to get picked up? Is she going to make it? And pre-cell phones, same. So I just cannot imagine doing that with my child today. So we had these very formative, fun experiences.
Totally formative. And like independent. And I don't remember ever worrying that I couldn't figure it out. Like it was just, if there was a problem, I guess I'd figure it out. But that was never like a concern. So that was really
right. Fun. Yeah. I feel like there are so many follow-up conversations that we could have about all those things. Yeah. But why are we here in this conversation? We're talking about integrated inquiry, which is one of the core areas that Blueprint is supporting and pushing forward. And when I think of inquiry and involving lots and lots of different people and different disciplines and bringing things together, you come to mind from some of the experiences that we've had together. We wanted to dig in a little bit behind the scenes on what motivates you to do the work that you do, what kinds of integrated inquiry you are part of or facilitating, able to see in the work that you do. But I want to just get your first sort of unedited thought. If somebody said, we want to do integrated inquiry between the sciences and the Christian faith, what would that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think personally, one of the most fun and exciting things about integrated inquiry is that moment when you realize the thing that you care a lot about, that you feel like you spend a lot of your time learning about and being good at understanding, you've turns out you've only just been like getting like a corner of it. And other people have been also interested in the same thing, and B, coming at it from a totally different perspective, a totally different way of asking questions, a totally different way of analyzing information and evidence, and just like getting at it from a totally different angle. And I find that really, I suppose some people can find that kind of threatening, but I just think it's so cool because we never see everything fully. And I like, say, Paul writes in First Corinthians, now we see through a glass dimly, then we shall see in full. And of course, he was writing about understanding, comprehending God's love. But I think that's God's love is certainly one part of that, but we're also only comprehending like partially about the nature of the world, just even our own self-understanding. And so to me, like part of what's really exciting about integrated inquiry is just the bringing together of different ways of seeing, of different ways of asking questions. And then you start to see both things that your own discipline can bring to it, but also where you may not have even realized you were falling short. And then likewise, I think others, you start to see and appreciate what a different angle to the same phenomenon can tell you more. But you're also then saying, have you thought about doing it this way or asking this question this way? So I think, yeah, the most exciting aspect is just pluralism, just different ways of seeing and putting things together, because the object of inquiry is big and you're never really going to get at it fully from just one angle. Yeah.
Now, I like to bring things as close down to the ground as possible and bring it to life. So, can you think of an example of what's something that you were starting to just grasp at the corner of, and then you realized there were other people in other disciplines coming at similar questions, but coming at it from a different angle? Do you have any specific stories or examples of topics, what that looks like?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I am fascinated by human experience of the religious. And use those words carefully because as a psychologist, my discipline allows me to mostly probe at or unpick the human experience of something. I'm not a theologian, and nor does my discipline have a metaphysic where that can make claims about the nature of God. I can only say things about how humans experience certain aspects of perhaps the nature of God. I am also married to a theologian and who is also interested in human experience, but from a theological perspective. So for him, he's asking questions about the significance of human experience in telling us truly something about God and what God is like, or what God is like when in the context of human experience with him, and whether there's any theological value in looking at human experience of God. So we have really fun conversations because we are both interested in the same thing, which is how humans experience God. And I'm interested in it descriptively and describing the processes, what do people think about God? How do they feel about God? What happens when they're angry at God? How do they experience the totality of God's love when it's so much bigger than what they can comprehend? How can we measure that? How can we quantify that? How can we describe that? And he's interested in sort of similar questions, but saying, how does that relate to the history and the Christian tradition? How does that kind of information from humans relate to the history and the tradition of Christian scholarship and theology, which is a discipline that I guess others have said to me is faith-seeking understanding. So how does human experience play in this seeking of understanding through faith and faith? So we look at the same thing, but from very different angles, and we each get something valuable when looking at the category of human experience. But we also recognize that each of us are getting at it from just one angle. In psychology, I like to tell people we like to theorize about the world, or we like to theorize about who humans are, but we usually validate that theorizing by counting. We quantify, which is great if you're counting the right thing. And it's not great if you're counting the wrong thing or you're only counting one part of the whole thing. And sometimes when I engage with theologians, that's when I realize, oh, we are counting something that's important, but it's not the whole thing. But the whole thing sometimes is so big that were we to try to count it comprehensively, it would be very difficult. And there would be some things that are lost in translation. So I guess that's an example of integrated inquiry where we bring psychology and theology to the table together and look at the question of the value and the nature of human experience of God.
Yeah. What do you think you'd be missing out on intellectually, conceptually, in your own experience? What would we be missing out on if it was just discipline specific or just isolated experience instead of this integrated approach?
I think we would miss out. I think there are two things. One, the kind of psychology that I do, and this is often very cross-sectional. We call it cross-sectional research. We're often taking a slice of time of people's experience of what God is like, or the transcendent experience, or something like that. Where even social experiences having nothing to do with religion, like our methodology is often, not always, but often cross-sectional, which means we only get a slice in time. And that's valuable and it's interesting and it's certainly deserving and worthy of our intellectual powers to try to understand. But I think with something like faith and religious experience, a lot of times the most interesting aspects of that unfold over time. And also unfold in language and in the contours of people's ways of describing God, or even in ways that they can't really verbalize. And I think if I wasn't aware that there's a different way to asking questions about the nature of experience that's just not cross-sectional and quantitative, I would be missing out on a really huge part of human experience and in the religious domain. Certainly, we are not very good. Psychologists are, because of our methodology, we're limited often in how much we can say about what happens to people as they change over time, and especially as they change over the life course. So that kind of temporal dimension is one thing. The other thing is just what I said about language. Sometimes religious experiences are really ineffable. The William James said there's an ineffable quality to transcendent experiences that kind of resists being pinned down by language. And some of the best theology is trying to capture that still in language, but expressing that ineffability, that difficulty of really describing the essence of what is being experienced. But because we're in psychology, we're often counting, and we need to count. People need to be able to figure out what it is that we're counting to tell us whether they're experiencing it or not. I think some of those aspects that are more ineffable, we just resist the common methodologies that are used in psychology, or at least in kind of the social experimental personality psychology of the sort that I was trained in.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you paint us a picture of other inquiry that you're a part of, that you are witnessing, other kinds of integrated inquiry that you just think is unlocking or unleashing potential that wouldn't be there without bringing in these multiple approaches?
So there are two programs of grants that I've been working on with Templeton World Charity Foundation that has been very exciting to me, partly because they create conditions where other researchers can have this experience of rubbing up against another way of knowing that they're not often familiar with. And so the first is this program that's come to an end. It's called Big Questions in Classrooms. And it's really about encouraging more of this multidisciplinary thinking in school education. And it's a program that's primarily happened in England, but in England, the school subjects, science, English, history, religious education, which is a subject that is taught in England in state schools and in private schools, they get increasingly siloed and boxed in, and the curriculum gets narrower and narrower, and there's more and more stuff to learn. And what we've been trying to do is to encourage teachers and students in a number of different subjects, but primarily in science and in religious education, to start to think beyond that particular body of knowledge and that particular way of knowing about the world. So obviously in sciences, it's about observation, experimentation, a big body of science, substantive science knowledge. And in religious education, there's theology and history and the nature of religions and religious life. And what's been really fun is that in some of the programs we've done where we've encouraged science teachers and religious education teachers to come together and look at their curriculum together and to look at some of their learning goals together, they start to realize they each have something to offer to the other. And that often what we've seen as science teachers coming to appreciate the kind of dialogic thinking and reasoning that religious education teachers provide for their students in their subjects. And so that's been really neat because like you and what we've been talking about, there's when you start to realize other people also share the goals that you have. So in this case, teachers wanting their students to be critical thinkers, wanting their students to be knowledgeable, wanting their students to develop a way of being able to comprehend the world using the best tools and methods at their fingertips, at their disposal. When you have science teachers and religious education teachers coming together and saying, and realizing, oh, we actually share a lot of these goals. And when we put different ways of knowing side by side, A, our students are more excited and more interested, and B, that's actually how the world really works. That the world, it doesn't get carved up in these sort of bodies of knowledge and ways of understanding. Like when we're when we're walking around, when we're having conversations with people, we're in nature going on a walk, we're not thinking, oh, biologically, this is happening. Oh, psychologically, I'm having this kind of perceptive experience. Right. And oh, religiously, I'm imposing this kind of meaning to understanding. That's not happening at all. When we're living, all of these ways of knowing, comprehending, recalling come into play. And so when teachers realize that some of these subject boundaries are really artificial and that education doesn't have to be that way, they get really excited. And their students are more engaged and more excited about what they're learning. So that's an area that's been really fun to see educators come to see this value in putting different disciplines and subjects together. The other area that's also been exciting, where we've also tried to create some of these experiences for researchers, is this program called the Science of Religious and Spiritual Exercises. And that program is really straightforward in that we're trying to identify spiritual religious disciplines that people practice and to understand psychologically what it is they do for people who practice them, especially insofar as they relate to positive outcomes. And one of the kind of requirements, or like what we strongly encourage researchers to do, is to actually just go and engage with practitioners and bring practitioners of these spiritual disciplines on board to be part of the project team to help refine. Like I was saying, we're often counting things, but we're not 100% sure we're counting the right thing. Bringing practitioners on board, having them tell you what they think is going on when people engage in these practices, to make sure when you're quantifying, you're actually tapping into hopefully the right thing, the meaningful thing, the meaningful aspects of that experience, of that phenomenon. And so seeing researchers give us positive feedback about how valuable that's been for them, that's been really encouraging for me. And sometimes researchers, especially those working in higher education or in research institutions, they're not often incentivized to do that. They're not often incentivized to step out of their particular disciplinary boundary and to work meaningfully with those in other disciplines. And so part of this program has been incentivizing and encouraging researchers to do that. And the positive feedback that we get from researchers when they say how meaningful it's been, how they feel like they're asking better questions because of that. And also just that it's fun. Like that's been really encouraging.
Yeah. What are some of the pushback that you have heard or that you've received directly in either of these examples that you shared? But does it sound like a beautiful, almost more natural way of being, in that we don't walk around thinking, these are my psychological thoughts over here, and these are my biological experiences, just experience life and think that. We have set up our classrooms and our university systems and our research in silos to be able to dig deep. And so what kind of pushback do you hear or do you see in engaging this integrated way?
Yeah. No, and I do get that pushback. And I think some of it is what we do need to recognize. So some of the pushback is that research is not rigorous, or there are certain norms and methods and norms of thought that we uphold that is considered as best in class in our discipline, and we should never get rid of that. And so if you introduce another discipline, you're muddying the waters. So you're right that this kind of interdisciplinary work often will get some pushback. And I think some of that pushback is legitimate, and some of it, I think, is perhaps just still relying on some of those artificial kind of boundaries and disciplinary boundaries that we talked about earlier. So one pushback is that that kind of research can never get published. And I think professionally, there are these kind of pathways to career success that are still very narrow and that can discourage certain researchers from participating or engaging in this kind of activity. And I think that has the idea that you can't do rigorous research that is also interdisciplinary, to me, is, I don't know, I feel like that's actually a hypothesis that we should be testing. Like, as opposed to just assuming that the best kind of research only happens in silos. And I know that there are, like, the world is increasingly open to interdisciplinary research. Certainly, I can see it in the sciences. So within the sciences, I think we're seeing a lot more collaboration between the basic sciences and the applied sciences. But that's still in the domain of science where there's still a common understanding of whether it's the quantification of methodologies or use of experimental methods or whatever it is, that within the broad umbrella of science, we are seeing more interdisciplinarity. So I think the kind of question, the pushback I get is often the bringing together of sciences and the humanities. And I think first it is important to recognize that disciplines have different preferred questions and methods and norms of thinking, like, for a reason. And they're trying to do different things. I guess it's like you have a toolbox and you wouldn't use a hammer to screw something in, and you wouldn't use a screw as a hammer. Like, I suppose if you use that analogy of the world being something that you can slowly scratch the surface of and take apart in meaningful ways, there are some tools that are better for certain tasks than others. So I think one part is just to not lose sight of the fact that disciplines, tools and methods and theories and disciplines are there because they're unpacking some phenomenon. And I think where there's pushback is either assuming that everything can be answered and assuming that the same phenomenon can be dealt with in the same way, just using a different methodology or just using a different discipline. And then there's just, I think, just the practical challenges of sometimes different disciplines come at a phenomenon with a different theory that is kind of has been derived from a history of thinking about that phenomenon in a certain kind of way. And it's not that one is you have to get out of the mindset that one is a better way of knowing than another. I think that's probably the biggest lesson is they do different things and there's value in both. And one is not better or more right or more correct than the other.
So you shared some about opportunities that exist by doing this integrated approach. You shared about some of the pushbacks and some of the challenges that you encounter or that you've seen in this integrated work. What would be your big theme or your big takeaway on the value of just doing this integrated work as the way of inquiry?
So, can I tell you a little story about my own life? And it's a little story that I think leads me to this interest in integrated inquiry. So when I had finished university, I was walking on the street in Boston, contemplating what I was going to do with my life. And I had my graduation certificate in hand. I'd just come out of this 4-year degree and the world is your oyster. And many of my friends were going straight into sort of very career path oriented kinds of work, whether it was medical school or consulting or investment banking, whatever. And I was like, and I remember thinking, I suppose the first thing I should do with this. And then at some point I might want to have a family. And then maybe after that I would do this. And I had this kind of, probably very type A, very linear way of thinking about how my life was going to go, like the plans I was going to make and the things that I was going to do, because that's what you do, right? You've been given a great education and it's your responsibility to figure out how to make the world a better place. And I thought, what better way to start than to make this kind of linear plan? I would do this and then I would do this and then I would do this. And as I was walking, I had something that I would probably, in hindsight, I would call a religious experience, but it wasn't the kind that kind of knocked you to the ground, or there wasn't some ray of light coming from the heavens that kind of illuminated my path. It was just this very small voice that said, but you love chicken taco salad. And that's not how you eat a chicken taco salad. That sounds really strange to you. I do really love chicken taco salads.
I love
with the shell and the salad and the chicken and all that, right? And the thing about a chicken taco salad is it doesn't taste good if you eat each part on its own, one after the other. It only tastes good, to me at least. It only tastes good. You break off the shell, which means some stuff is going to leak out. And then you use that shell to scoop up the sour cream and the chicken, pile it on, and it's kind of messy, and you have to eat it. Like, to really enjoy it, for me to really enjoy it, I have to break it apart and let it be messy. And I don't like that. I am very type A, and I did not like that. But I realized in that moment that was a truth for my life, is that my life was not going to be happen in this kind of linear way, that it was always going to be bringing together these different parts of myself, what I loved, the things that I was good at, and it was not going to happen in this kind of sequential linear manner. And that it's better if things come together and you layer things on top of each other. And that's how I approached my life since then. And really how I think about inquiry is it's better. It's more interesting. It's more fun. And it's more true to the thing when you're able to look at that from different angles. And it might not mean meshing everything up, because you have scholarly rigor and you have methods, but it does mean being open to pulling different ways of seeing the world, different parts of yourself, following the thing that interests you, and moving through life in this kind of chicken taco salad way. So I look at my past. I love music. I still love music. I have this wonderful history of engaging with missions where I saw people living life in very different ways of being. But then because I was working with these churches, still comprehending the love of God through a language and through ways that I understood too. So me as a Christian and like a 16-year-old girl in Mongolia who also wanted to talk about God and Jesus. We are so different, but we are so not different in certain kinds of ways. And I think that's how I see disciplines too. Like, we are so different. Theology and psychology are so different. For certain things in the world, and you look at them, it's not so different after all. And I think it's just being open to that, being open and curious and not assuming the way you know is the best way or the only way or the true way, because we only see through the glass darkly. That's how I think about it.
I absolutely love food analogies. I love most analogies. So I think that's how we learn and how we remember. And I love food analogies in particular. And your taco salad integration metaphor analogy, that's going to stick with me. I will quote you on this, but I will probably use this when doing facilitation and things, because I love that you said when you break off the outer shell, it's going to get a little messy. Some stuff is going to leak out. And I think that just speaks to the truth of what these multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, interfaith, intercontext experiments are like. They're a little bit messy and create a much stronger result than if you were just eating those things individually. So I love that analogy. I will carry that forward. I don't know if we can beat taco salad or chicken taco salad as the metaphor to close on. So I think that can be where we leave things today. But buddy, thank you so much for sharing what you have. I do want to give you a chance at adding anything else. Do you have any final thoughts or comments that come to mind that you want to be sure we leave today?
So as a Christian and as a person who loves to think about stuff, I guess that's why I did a PhD. I like to think and I like to know more. I think that God's given us minds and ways of comprehending. And ultimately, I think the world is just endlessly fascinating because it's an endlessly creative God who made it. And so I think with integrated inquiry, it's a way for me to make that kind of evident and obvious and explicit, and a way to own that gift of different ways of knowing that God has given to us so that we can comprehend God better and so that we can love each other better. So my encouragement is don't let faith be something that is just in parallel with scholarship. See it as a strength, use it as a lens to look for interesting phenomenon in the world, in yourself or in other humans. Like use that as a lens to find what's really neat and interesting. Because I think it's in faith that we're tapping into the bigger, that we're tapping into in the words, in Christian words, a loving God. And that should illuminate like even more interesting things about ourselves and about our world that is just waiting to be unpacked or rediscovered, really. So I guess that's my closing thought on integrated inquiry is it's a power. It's a superpower because it should open you up to interesting and new things that you might not have thought of before because you're tapping into something that's really real.
I love all the metaphors that you're leaving us with. It's your superpower. And when you get hungry, chicken taco salad. But those just so beautifully bring to life the point behind doing the integrated inquiry and living that integrated life as well and seeing the lens. And now I'm going to also probably have to quote you on it's your superpower because you're tapping into that greater source. You've just articulated things so beautifully and so memorably. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for being with us, Bonnie. With that, we will wrap up today's episode of Integration Unraveled. Thanks for listening.